Hello, I'm Alta Ifland. I am originally from Romania, but I lived for 30 years in the United States and I've been living for the past 2 years in France. And I'm going to read poems from two collections of prose poems published in the United States. The first collection from which I will read is called The Snail Song, and it's a collection I wrote in English and published in 2011. It was published by Split and Duyvil in New York. And it also has some doodles that I created for this purpose. So the first one is called The Chimney Sweeper. Even after he disappeared, swallowed by the mythology of the past, his name and image remained in songs and in those pins with white and red thread we used to put on our chest to welcome spring. Those tiny brooches in metal or plastic called mărțișoare, that is, little marches, named for March, represented flowers, little hearts, birds, usually a symbol of something. In the same way, the little marches themselves stood for spring, a symbol of a symbol. The white thread stood for winter and the red one for summer. The foot of their fight was spring. The chimney sweeper was one of the most popular little marches, for it too stood for something, luck. Its blackness was turned into its opposite, white, luck. Excrements were also a sign of luck. On the other hand, running into a priest was like running into the devil or a black cat. One had to cross oneself, spit, and take 3 steps back. One also had to spit 3 times on a baby whose cuteness triggered admiration in order to chase away the evil eye. Funny, this was supposed to be a poem about a chimney sweeper, and it became a story about what one can find if one looks down the chimney. Like those children in a Dickens novel, used by evil, greedy men to sweep chimneys, who fall down the dark, narrow tunnel, only to come back years later in white suits, rich, happy, accompanied by the sister they lost at birth. So, as you could hear, the image here is that of what we call little marches, mărțișoare, which is a pin you put to welcome spring. You put it on your chest. I think the Bulgarians have this too. And the most common one was the chimney sweeper. So the image of the chimney sweeper brought back to memory a lot of other Romanian customs and superstitions. And the next poem, it's called Ashes and Cinnamon, and it comes with a drawing, which I will show you at the end of the after I read it. The Sunday strolls on the Corso, the main downtown street, where the traffic stopped on weekends, smelled of vanilla and tasted like ice cream. The city's working class, as they said on TV and in the papers, was out in its Sunday best, the men in their suits, the women in their colorful dresses. Vendors on the sidewalk sold ice cream cones and cotton candy, which we called sugar on a stick. And the little girl watched in fascination as the latter unfolded its ghostly body of gauze. Her favorite ice cream was chocolate ice cream on a stick, a kind she's never seen since, with a mass of ice cream like a reed's brown elongated top. Ice cream was a Sunday ritual, as she was usually not to have any, a fragile child prone to frequent colds. And then there were the vendors that appear years later with their hot dogs, which everyone called dicks in a bun, because the bun was scooped out and the hot dog was stuck inside upwards like a virile member with mustard all around. But that was later, and by then the ice cream on a stick and the sugar on a stick had disappeared, as did the smell of vanilla and the Sunday suits. And now the Corso is made of layers of disintegrated bubbles of time, a layer of cinnamon and one of ashes, with the ashes gradually covering everything and the cinnamon retreating in memory's cellars for future excavations. And this is the doodle that I created, which represents a family on a Sunday walk. Just checking the sound here. Sorry. Okay, the next poem, it's called Wedding in the Balkans. And it was inspired by traditions in my paternal grandparents' village in the southern part of Romania, which is called Oltenia, where people live in a very traditional way. When I was a child, they still lived in the same way their ancestors had lived hundreds of years ago. And so, for example, one custom that still survived when I was a child, but I'm pretty sure is dead now, is that when in the after the wedding night, during which, of course, the bride was supposed to be a virgin, the people took out the blood-stained sheet, or the sheet which was supposed to be blood-stained. That was still a custom that remained. And another thing that triggered this poem is the fact that people had a very kind of violent rhetoric in my grandparents' village. They used a lot of curses. So these two images were um, represented here. It's called Wedding in the Balkans. Their weddings are made of different time stuff. They begin with a contest. First, the two mothers-in-law spit out all the curses they've accumulated in a lifetime. From may you burn in hell with all your family and the children of your children, to may your mouth go dry and your tongue go rotten. The latter, the worst of all. How is one to curse with a dry mouth and a rotten tongue? For hours they spit out their venom, exorcising all their demons, until the two families are purified and their children can unite. But this time, the bride's mother said something different, something no one expected. May you never forget, she said. Then the other woman stopped, with a curse stuck on her lips, unable to let it go. Later in the day, the procession left the bride's house, she in her long white gown, and the female guests in their colorful dresses, with a paid jester telling one obscene joke after another, thus working up the crowd before they would arrive at the groom's house, where the couple was to be locked up in the bridal chamber, while the crowd waited by the door and eventually exploded in cheers. As the groom emerged, holding up like a flag the white blood-stained sheet. But this time the procession left with the bride while the groom waited with his own folk, and waited, and the bride never arrived. Snowflakes big as daisies had begun to fall on the bride's procession, though it was summer, and an icy wind started to blow, carrying away the women's straw hats, pulling up their skirts and unveiling their legs, and they walked like this for hours without going anywhere. And then for days, and their hair grew white with icicles, and their feet stumbled in the snow that was now up to their knees, and they walked for weeks and for months until they could move no longer. And the groom waited a whole year until someone brought the news that a group of cheerful wedding guests had been spotted in the mountains, time frozen into statues of snow, and one could steal the crystal glasses in their hands with the frozen red wine, and the frozen smiles on their faces, and the bride's gown barely distinguishable on the white background. And the groom ordered a painting to be made after the frozen tableau mort from what had once been nature vivante, and he never forgot. Okay, the next poem, it's called Why They Call It the Old World. It is not for nothing that they call it the Old World. In her grandparents' village, things are the way they were hundreds of years ago. Some Western journalists say that many people regret communism, but they understand nothing. What people regret is not communism, but the past. In that part of the world, the past is always better. For scarves they wrap around their necks, streams of blood, passed on from generation to generation. And they lament the old days, so much so that when the villagers in her grandparents' village had to elect their mayor, the majority re-elected the old mayor in spite of an insurmountable handicap. The man was no longer of this world. In an interview, a villager explained, I know he's dead, but I don't want any change. So this was from the Snail song with drawings of my own. And the letter, this poem, why they call it the Old World, I also translated it into Romanian just so you can hear a little bit of Romanian. De ce se numește lumea veche? Nu degeaba lumea veche se numește așa. În satul bunicilor ei, totul e ca acum sute de ani. Unii ziariști occidentali spun că lumea regretă comunismul, dar nu înțeleg nimic. Ceea ce lumea regretă nu e comunismul, ci trecutul. În partea asta de lume, trecutul e întotdeauna mai bun. Drept fular, oamenii își pun la gât râuri de sânge, transmise din generație în generație și se gândesc cu nostalgie la zilele de odinioară. Astfel încât atunci când sătenii din satul bunicilor ei au trebuit să aleagă un nou primar, majoritatea l-au ales pe cel vechi, în ciuda unui handicap insurmontabil. Omul nu mai era pe lumea asta. Într-un interviu, un consătean a explicat, știu că e mort, dar nu vreau să se schimbe nimic. I'm now going to read from another collection, which is from the book Voix, which I wrote initially in French and translated into English, so it's a bilingual book. It's my first published book. I published it in 2007 with a publisher from Los Angeles, Prose, which now is now defunct. The book is out of print, and so that's why I don't no longer have copies. This is the cover of the book. I'm actually looking for another publisher, if everyone is interested. And so I'm going to read the translation into English, which is my third language. And I think at the end, I'm going to read just one poem in French so you can get a taste of the original. The sweetness of things in the old days. In the old days, things were wrapped in sweetness as in a layer of lavender honey. And when they happened, the sweetness surged inside them as inside a stem and spilled on the ground, and the whole world smelled of honey and peace. In the old days, men went out in suits on Sundays, and women wore flowery dresses. I, too, in the old days, wore a little flowery dress and a little white hat and clung to my father's hand. He was dressed in a suit on Sundays. Every Sunday, we crossed the park together on our way home. And before reaching the pastry shop at the corner, we stopped at the big house with climbing foliage, and I played with Edda's toys. Her name is all I remember. No, I didn't play with her toys. I touched them as one touches things wrapped in a layer of honey. And I was already breathing their death to come and savoring the sweetness, their sweetness in small gulps. Did I mention that we were returning from the football game? So I brought for you the photos that inspired this poem. I'm sorry. This is me at 2 years old with my father on Sunday. My father, as you can see, is dressed in a suit, as were all the other men around. If you can look, you can see that all the men around were wearing, you can see another man wearing a suit. Because at the time, people dressed on Sunday in their best clothes, which is no longer a custom, unfortunately. So I'm going to continue with other poems from the same collection. This one is called The Emigrant, and it summarizes my experience of coming as an immigrant, as a political refugee, in fact, to America in September 1991. The Emigrant. So many times his story has unfolded before our eyes. In the distance, the shore gradually coming into sight, and surging out of the fog, peeling like rags, the statue, embodied myth, utopia made flesh of so many domesticated dreams. And then the moored ship, the misery of the anonymous, destitute body, the emigrant who opens his eyes on the new world like a newborn. But this emigrant, whose story I know, A young girl who set foot ashore, or rather landed, in New York one September day, didn't even have the chance to see the famous statue. She will only see it several years later, when the emigrant's arrival will no longer be even a reference point in a personal myth. Because this emigrant was so dazed that she had even forgotten to look for the signs of an exotic landscape, which she could later have invoked in the mythology of her reconstituted biography. What the emigrant had kept in her emigrant memory was, in order and according to the emotional impact: 1. The glowing windows of the Reykjavik airport, where the plane had stopped on its way to New York. 2. The bizarre breakfast at JFK, made of several little sausages covered in a sweet sauce called, as the young girl would find out later, maple syrup. 3. The numerous lines and checkpoints the emigrants had to pass through under the surveillance of various people, apparently civilians, and yet carrying an authority which, in the emigrants' eyes, assumed religious proportions, for these people spoke their language. Who were they? Where were they leading the emigrants? And beneath all this, a subterranean rumor accompanying the long human cohort, and the vague, unclear feeling of guilt the emigrant always feels when he has to pass through doors watched on both sides by inscrutable guardians. The feeling that someone at all times was watching them and giving them a grade for good behavior. 4. The bus stop, where a megaphone warned the passengers every 3 minutes to be vigilant and not to leave their baggage unattended, and where the emigrants had embarked to take another plane for the south of the country. This image stayed in the young girl's memory as the symbol of the city, swarming with people and sounds, in the heart of which she thought she was. It was only many years later that she understood that the scene was part of the airport, which she hadn't left for a second. So here I'm basically narrating narrating my arrival at JFK in New York, where I spent several hours on my way to Florida. And all this time I thought that I was in the city itself, in New York itself, because I had never imagined that an airport could have trees inside it, stores, and buses running around. I mean, that you could take. So, and you could, because we took a bus and we were transported from one terminal to another. So that was my experience arriving at JFK. And now the next poem is called Burials, and it narrates a very specific Romanian custom, which is that of funerals. Romanians had, I think, the most elaborate funerals in Europe. I remember when I arrived as an immigrant in America and I met somebody from Cleveland, which is the place where live many Eastern European immigrants. The first thing this person told me, "Oh, you Romanians have great funerals." So this is this poem Burials is a narration of this custom, but it's a little surreal. The days when there were no weddings, one could most certainly count on a burial. It always started with a tune coming from far away, which could be heard even through the closed windows. A tune I've never heard since, always the same. Somber yet somehow gregarious, maybe because of the sound of the drum and the trumpets, which was so much like the park fanfare on summer evenings. At first barely a sound, then stronger and stronger, spilling on the streets where the corpse was taken, as they said, for his last stroll. In a coffin mounted on a car, in the past a carriage drawn by horses, but this was before my time. The deceased toured the city under the eyes of excited onlookers, and at times even imposed his last wishes. If the car stopped suddenly for no apparent reason, it was because the deceased must have been angry at someone. If it began to rain, he must have left this life with regrets. Once the tour of the city ended, the crowd went to the cemetery where, if the deceased was a man, and it was almost always was, don't ask me why, the widow and other women in his entourage engaged in a series of moanings and lamentations and "why did you leave me so and so?" and genuflections and faintings, and when the deceased had finally been set down in the grave, it was the pomana, that is the giving in his memory, the feast, and then it was time for all kinds of sausages, chicken soup with noodles, sauerkraut with ground meat, polenta and kefta, eau de vie and homemade wine. And the guests were warming up, and someone would say, well, may the dead rest with the dead, and the living feast with the living. And everybody raised their glasses in a toast. And then someone would take his coat off, and soon everyone began taking their clothes off. The women stayed in their bras and white cotton underpants, their plump bellies moving up and down in the rhythm of their voluptuous breathing. The men in shorts showed their black hair that covered their backs like an unkempt lawn, and their huge bellies came so close to the ground due to gravity that they had to sit with their legs in the air to keep from touching it. While the whole crowd, men and women, sipped coffee in the adjacent room, the widow, also in bra and white underpants, a pair of scissors in her hand, proceeded to attack the matrimonial bed, cut into the mattress, and with pagan joy emptied the contents, which soon filled the air with big incandescent snowflakes. And finally, there they were, she yelled, the bills, the hidden savings of the deceased, emerged, little banners sticking out of the snowdrift. And at the moment when the guests rushed inside to see the treasure, the widow let out a second howl, this time of pain, for the bills had long since expired. And then she lay down on the broken mattress, while the disappointed guests went back to their stories about the deceased, who had always loved to play tricks on those who knew him. The Summer Kitchen. Okay, so this poem, it's a description of what we call the summer kitchen in the same paternal village of my grandparents, and which, as I said, was very traditional and where people lived the way their ancestors had lived hundreds of years ago. And so this shed that was outside the house was called the summer kitchen. They called it the summer kitchen because it occupied a small shed outside the house, a shed of whitewashed wooden boards with packed earth inside, and because they only used it in the summer. Inside, it was always a little cool, but a welcoming coolness, in which the body gladly wrapped itself on hot afternoons. The kitchen was always sunk in semi-darkness, spotted here and there by patches of light that found their way through the holes in the wood, and which unveiled alongside the walls on all three sides shelves with pots of earth, of red clay and wood, pots of all sizes and shapes, breathing wisdom and voluptuousness, calm and peace. In one of these jugs was the milk from the morning milking, smelling like hay and meadows, animal closeness, and something sharp coming from the cow itself, and which the granddaughter found a little repulsive. This didn't stop her at all from searching each afternoon for the above-mentioned milk jug, in which a thick cream top had formed, and from carefully and skillfully skimming it. Afterwards, she would put back the cover and inspect the other pots. After the milk jug, it was the big honey jar that triggered her attention. It was its substance that intrigued her, like a hybrid between the sun's gold and the brown forest. She would taste the honey, then listen to the silence flowing into the pots and the wooden boards, and then returning from the pots and boards in concentric, infinite circles. Only a fly dared to break the silence at times, but even its little sound was part of it. A little later, the old woman came, a big armful of branches and twigs on her head. She laid them on the ground and entered the kitchen. There she built the fire in the oven and set the cooking pots, usually 3 or 4, a soup, a stew, and in the Dutch iron cauldron, the polenta. The oven. It must have stayed the same for centuries, it too whitewashed, built directly on the ground, all its corners round, its back smooth and oval, the hearth beneath, and on top a metal sheet on which the dishes simmered. On a little wooden chair, the old woman sparked off the fire with several twigs and a little kerosene, And when the first flame appeared, she began stirring the pot's content with a big wooden spoon, and they were soon sizzling and exuding vapors and aromas. And the granddaughter sat beside her, she too on a little wooden chair, and watched the fire for hours and listened to its crackling and the pot's sizzling, her cheeks reddened by heat and restrained joy. And the fire kept reflecting in her eyes, filling them with memories to come. And in her eyes, time stopped, and the present flowed into the past, and the past into the future, rich with silence and words. So this poem that I just read, well, in the poem, the woman that I talk about, it's obviously my grandmother, and I'm very sorry I have no photos. And also, I don't have any photos of the oven, which was, as I say, and as I describe it, was a type of oven that I think today exists probably only in Afghanistan and in one of those traditional countries. Okay, the last poem I'm going to read is called I, and I will first read it in English, and then I'll read it in the French original so you can get a taste of the original. I, when I look at these photos of old Balkan peasants with their somber, tough gaze, furs thrown on their shoulders, tanned faces furrowed by wrinkles, straight bodies as if wrapped in the smoke of time going by, I find myself letting out a cry of surprise, like the tourist I have become. What faces and what beautiful coats, like saying, exotic. And from the depths of the past, my grandparents' faces resurface, brown and sharp-featured like mute tree bark, and I know they are still there inside me, but ever receding, unreal, untouchable. Who is I? And now the French. Moi, quand je regarde ces photos de vieux paysans des Balkans, au regard dur et sombre, fourrure jetée sur l'épaule, visage hâlé, creusé de rides, démarche droite et comme enveloppé dans la fumée du passé qui s'envole, je m'exclame comme la touriste que je suis devenue. Quel beau visage et quel beau manteau. Autant dire exotique. Et des abîmes du passé qui revient, les visages de mes grands-parents remontent, bruns et secs, pareils à l'écorce sans voix, et je sais qu'ils sont toujours là, en moi, mais comme en retrait, lointain, invraisemblable. Qui est moi? So, thank you.